Hey, everybody, welcome to the lecture for professional firefighting. So far in the class, we've talked about how fire has been used for agriculture, and we've talked about urbanization, and we started to have the conversation around historical fires. Some of those are wildlands, some of those are urban fires. And we're also today going to be talking about how firefighting as a profession developed and some of the inequalities that we see going on in firefighting. We are also going to be watching a couple videos for this week. We're going to be watching a video on the Triangle Fire, which is one of the worst industrial urban fires to happen in US history. We are also going to be watching kind of a short video around the integration of the NYPD in the 1980s. We're going to be talking about who are firefighters and where they came from. So let's go ahead and get in. Right, so firefighting as a profession. Now, in order to understand firefighting as a profession, we're going to take a little trip into the world of sociology and social science, because firefighting as a profession is an incredibly gendered and racially divided field and has been for most of its existence. And that is actually still true today. So let's talk about what is sociology. So sociology is the study of the development, structure, and functioning of human society across time, place, here, and now. We look at, as sociologists, as social patterns, social interactions, and cultures. This includes social roles and norms. So firefighter is a role that society has put together as a potential option for individuals to take part in. There's lots of other social roles, and we'll talk about a little bit more about what that is. But these social roles happen to help us create our identity. You all have a lot of social roles. Some of them are earned, and some of them were given to you. Now, unlike psychology, which tends to look at the individual, sociology looks at groups of people and their collective experience. So it's really important to note this, because I often hear from students the phrase, yes, but I know someone who. Yeah, yes, there are exceptions, but it's really important for us to not just uphold the exceptions. It's really important for us to understand what are the generalized experiences of groups of people in society. What are their barriers? What are the things they don't have barriers to? This includes their economic access, their access to roles in society. And so we look at larger general trends as opposed to the individual experience. So during this lecture, you might hear something where you go, yeah, but I have this other experience. Well, that doesn't invalidate your experience. It just means, as a general trend, that is not the experience people are having. So that the story of one, as we like to call it in sociology, is an important story, but it's the exception to the rule. It's not the rule. And in sociology, we are interested in what are the general trends. We look at groups of people and their collective experiences, and this is often understood and looked at through positions of power and hierarchies. Western society, and actually most global societies, are incredibly hierarchical, which means some people are given preference over others. And you are born into these societies, and you are socialized to that being the norm. And especially if you're in a dominant group, you might not even realize that there's something different out there. There's lots of studies to back that up. So if you hear something in this lecture again where you're like, yeah, but okay, yes, you might have had that experience, but that's not the generalized experience of other groups of people. So we don't focus on the story of one. And it's also important to note that you are a social being. You were socialized by your parents and your family, and then maybe a religious institution, and then schools, and then friends and other groups of people, into thinking about what your role is in society, what the norms and expectations are for you, given your set of characteristics. And some of these are what we call ascribed, and some of these are what we call achieved, and we'll talk more about that. But when you violate those expectations, there are consequences. We also know that in society, there are barriers that people have that are put in place because of these hierarchies. And so again, this is not a blame game. This is just describing the realities of the situation, so that if we want to create a more equitable society, we can, right? So not necessarily everybody is equal, but a more equitable, because everybody has different needs. So a one size solution is not the way we need to go. We're going to talk about social roles and norms, and we're going to use this through the lens of who can and cannot be a firefighter. And we're going to spend a lot of this lecture focusing on gender as one of the ways that we impose barriers to some groups of people and give access to others. So there are three main characteristics to a stratified system. This is all systems, all social systems. So when we think through stratification, the rankings apply to social categories of people who share common characteristics without necessarily interacting or identifying each other. The process of being ranked can be changed by the person being ranked. It often can't be changed by the person being ranked. So we have a society that is stratified by gender, stratified by economics, stratified by race, stratified by ability, stratified by learning capabilities, and how much access we create for you is often determined around what categories you fall in. So we all have race, we all have a gender, we all have a social class, we all have our own level of abilities, and those intersect to create our identity. So when you hear this term out in the world called intersectionality, that is around how your different identities impact your access to certain roles and certain norms and certain resources. So people's life experiences and opportunities depend upon their social categories. Like I said, we put barriers up. We often hear this term privilege, right? What does it mean to be privileged? And I think it's really important to kind of define that for you, because it is often misunderstood. So a privilege, if you were to Google social privilege, people will talk about benefits you get. But there's a growing amount of literature that talk in terms of barriers. And I actually prefer to think in terms of these barriers. So this is blocking as opposed to elevating. So people can have barriers put in their way, social barriers, along with the roles and norms they can and cannot have, based on a whole host of different potential identities that they have. Your identity, by the way, is not static in a lot of cases. Like, they can change. So when we think about ableism, how able-bodied you are, able-minded you are, able-learning you are, those different ableisms are ways that we have barriers to people that lack those abilities. So for instance, if I have access to a building and I only put in stairs, people who can walk and walk well can easily get up those stairs. But if you're in a wheelchair, or you have serious other types of mobility issues that for which stairs become a barrier, you can't get into that building. Now, people that can walk up the stairs may not even think about the fact that there's a whole group of people who can't get into that building. We have a number of buildings like this on campus, by the way, where if you need to take a ramp to get in, you have to kind of go around the building to find the one ramp to get in. And we have some buildings where they don't have doors that open easily. And some of the doors are really heavy. And so getting into that building, that's a physical barrier to people getting into that building. That's an example of a barrier. So people's life experiences and opportunities depend upon how society categorizes them, and what kind of barriers they experience because of those categorizations. And then finally, the ranks of different social categories are slow to change over time, but in many ways do change towards the arc of inclusion. At least that's been the case thus far. So sticking with this physical body accessibility issue, back in the early 1990s, when there was a representative in the House who started to have access issues, like he needed a ramp, he couldn't really do stairs, we get something called the American Disabilities Act. The American Disabilities Act said that public institutions and federal institutions have to ensure that people can get into places. Up until that point in time, that wasn't necessarily a thing. Nobody had to put in ramps. They could just have stairs, and that would physically make access to those buildings a barrier. We also see changes in our Constitution around this. So for instance, we had an entire class of people in the United States called slaves, and slaves were legally able to be owned by other people. Like, your mind, body, and soul was their property. You did not have the ability to choose what you wanted to do, or where you wanted to go, or who you wanted to be, or what you wanted your job to be. Now, we fought a war about this, but even at the time of the American Revolution, abolitionists of slavery, these are the people that are anti-slavery, were stating that slavery in and of itself was an affront to the Declaration of Independence, and we should abolish this. And so over time, we abolished slavery. Slavery as a legal category is no longer a class of persons. We also eventually did that for women. Women were property. Women were property first of their fathers and then of their husbands. They did not have legal rights. And over time, women have gained more and more legal rights. So this is important to kind of think about, that we have this arc of history in the United States where we are creating a more equitable society. So what are some of the social statuses that people have? And what is a social status? So to understand social stratification, we need to understand social status and roles. So a status and a role. So a status is where you fall in the hierarchy. A role is a position in society you are expected to do based on your identity. So I put this graph, this is from like an intro to social text, so you can see what we're thinking about. So there are ascribed statuses and achieved statuses. Ascribed statuses often have to do with physiological relations or physiological identities, and achieved statuses are things that you can change. A lot of times these are not things you can change. So this example is of somebody who identifies as female. Gender, by the way, is one of the ways that we have created hierarchies. Gender is malleable, just so we're clear on that. There are cultures that have up to 6 genders. So there are cultures that have up to 6 genders. So this idea that there's only this binary gender thing is not accurate. Age is absolutely a social status. So most of you are in the 18 to 24 category. We call you young adults. You also have a generational identity. People watching this lecture are probably Gen Zs. There might be a few of you who are young millennials. maybe the occasional excerpt, but there's all these ideas about who these generations are and what you're expected to do based on your generation and etc. We have familial relations. So daughter and sister are based on familial relationships. These are defined oftentimes in American society by biological relations, right? So your parents are often your birth parents, although that is certainly malleable, right? We have lots of people who are adoptive, who have adoptive parents, or have parents who are close relatives who are parenting them. So this is also ascribed, but something that's not just carved in stone. And then we have race. Just so we're clear, if we peeled everybody's skin off and we tested your DNA, for the most part, everybody's the same. Like, we're all Homo sapiens sapiens. That's who we are. We see the concept of race as we understand it today, actually created in the 1500s. Before that, it was more based on where you were born. So if you had a lot of melanin in your skin, but you were born in France, you were French. Today, we define those with more melanin as Black. That was not a thing. It was based on where you were located. And so that also tells you that this idea of race is malleable. That is not to say that the current definitions of race and gender and family don't have incredibly real consequences for people. They do. They absolutely do, because we've created social hierarchies around these created identities. And those hierarchies have very real consequences in people's lives. Now we have a whole bunch of statuses that we call achieve status. So if you're watching this, you are a college student. One of your primary identities is a student. You've probably been a student most of your life. Sooner rather than later, hopefully, this identity is going to go away because you are going to graduate and you will no longer be a student. You'll be something else. You might be an employee, you might be a friend, you might be a spouse. There's a whole bunch, you might be a parent. Those are all identities that can happen, that can change over time. But so ascribed statuses are usually assigned or assumed at birth. They're often involuntary. Very rarely do people choose these. They're often chosen for you based on physical characteristics and social norms, cultural expectations, cultural standards. And then achieve status are things that you are capable of doing, right? You're all capable of going to college because you're sitting in Fire and Society as a student. So when we think through stratified societies, there are groups that are dominant and groups that are subordinate. Subordinate groups understand they are subordinate very early on because they lack visual and physical representation of themselves in the broader social narrative. They do not see examples of themselves. We talk today about the idea that representation is important, and it is, because subordinated groups that don't see themselves as part of society don't think of those opportunities. So subordinated groups are usually treated unequally. So they often experience prejudice, discrimination, and social inequality. They usually have some sort of distinguished trait that allows the broader society to group them together. Okay, and then members are aware of their subordinated status. So we know from a lot of research, I'm going to use race as an example, that children that are minorities know that they don't see themselves in a lot of places, especially in the media. And so they often are very aware that the people on TV are different than they are. We see this emerge between the ages of 2 and 3. So that's very young that we start to see this in-group association and the subordinated status of these individuals come into play. Now, the dominant group, on the other hand, regardless of which dominant group you're in, the dominant group often doesn't realize the lack of barriers that they experience, the lack of access they experience. There's just a general lack of awareness. That is not to say that that's their fault, but when we don't talk about barriers and access and privilege as part of a regular conversation, we can't make those changes. But people in the dominant group are usually in positions of power, prestige, and have access to resources in ways that other people don't. And so creating that conversation becomes more difficult for subordinated groups because they're told, oh, you're just making it up. It's really not that bad. Yeah, of course you do. You just don't understand, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of dismissiveness that happens by dominant groups when subordinates are like, hey, yo, this is not okay. So when we think through dominant groups, we talk about power, prestige, and resources. Power is especially important because this is the ability to dictate what is and is not acceptable. And that includes behaviors, beliefs, which cultural practices are okay, whose political ideologies, which races get to be privileged, which genders get to be privileged, whether disabled people have access to resources, so on and so forth. And often power stems from their control over resources and their ability to make the rules. So when you're in a position of power, you have more capabilities to be able to make the rules. Now, some of you are sitting here in your head going, yeah, but I am a white, I'm going to use this as an example. I'm a white male, but I grew up poor and I didn't have access to any of those things. The barriers you experienced were around economic status. You didn't experience those barriers because of your gender and your race. So remember I talked about intersectionality? This is where those intersectionalities come in. You may be privileged in certain aspects of your life, and you may be subordinated in other aspects of your life. And the subordinated process, by the way, you're much more aware of areas where you're subordinated because, like I said on the last slide, people in the subordinated group are more aware of their subordinations, right? So you're aware of all of the identities that you experience barriers in a lot more in terms of life outcomes and obstacles that you experience than you do the privileged positions you have in the dominant groups, the dominant identities you experience. Remember, we're complicated individuals. We don't just have one identity. We have multitudes of identities. Those identities come together for intersectionality. So power is around access to resources, the ability to make the rules, the access to creating ascribed power, right? So when we talked about ascribed power, we use the example of a student. Well, for a very long time, the only people that get to go to college were white men. And so that privileged experience of being a college student was limited for those who didn't fall into those ideas. Now, we do see the development of women's colleges, but those are not doing hardcore science and all those sorts of things. The same with Black colleges. We see the development of HBCUs and Hispanic colleges and other types of minority institutions. But even if you got a college degree, you were limited in what jobs you could get compared to those who went to a white male-dominated college. Most of the institutions in this country, by the way, were established as white male-dominated institutions. We have seen integration happen, and that's awesome and amazing, yay. But we still don't have full equity. So, and then we have prestige. So this is the reputation or influence arising from success. We have a new privileged population that have been emerging lately called influencers. We've always had people who were influencers, but it's not in the same way as it is now. And that's because we didn't have social media. So someone with prestige has the ability to influence others based on their success, their achievement, their family, or other types of favorable attributes. So both power and prestige give you access to resources. So these can be tangible resources like land. These can be intellectual resources like education. They can be social resources like networks. But those resources are all incredibly important in order to have power. So a lot of the dominant groups keep their power because they have access to different resource groups. So we're going to talk next about using gender as a lens to understand power. So let's talk for a minute about gender. Defining what gender is, it's complicated, just so you know. So understanding gender requires an understanding of the interactions between biological, social, and cultural systems. So the biological system refers to physical characteristics, often framed around reproduction. It's often interpreted as gender, but the biology is incredibly complicated. So we often think in terms of this weird binary XY. But there's a lot more going on in biological sex than X chromosomes and Y chromosomes. First of all, there are 6 different combinations of X and Y chromosomes alone. So we already now have 6 biological genders. You have XY, which we generally call males, XX, which is what we call females, XO, XXX, XYY, and XXY. So we have a whole bunch of different ways that we can think through this biology. But this XY dichotomy is also incorrect. It's complicated because gender isn't just this weird XY dichotomy. So you can have an X, but you've got an X showing up on the wrong chromosome. You can have a Y that's not really doing much. You can have other genes that didn't turn on at the right time or turned on too early, because physiological sex isn't just based on XY chromosomes. So we're using this weird shortcut of XY that is not actually part of reality. It is so much more complicated than you could possibly think of in terms of the reality of biology. And so when we think of this biological system, it is not just girls are XX and boys are XY. It is so much more complicated because you have all of these other genes that go into this. Matter of fact, you could be genetically male, your Y chromosome didn't turn on, and you present biologically as a female, and vice versa. So those are possible. So whatever your bits and pieces are may not actually reflect your genetics. And how those the SRY genes, where they got stuck, really is going to influence that as well. And then we have all these other chromosomes that go into this. So to say that there's only XX and XY is factually untrue. Now we have cultural and social systems. Now, the vast majority of people present physically, their phenotype presents often as a uterus and breast development, or a penis and a lack of breast development, right? So the majority of people have these systems that are in alignment. So we've created, at least in Western culture, these binary systems based on that. And again, I want to emphasize, there are plenty of other cultures that have a whole diversity of genders, not this binary. But we've created these cultural and social systems based on theoretical ideas of capability. So this idea of gender is a sociocultural elaboration of sex. It is completely constructed. What men and women are capable of doing really can overlap. I mean, this idea that men can be, granted, if you're not uterine and you don't have the proper hormones, birthing probably isn't going to be something that you're going to do. But there are plenty of uterine people who also can't birth or also can't conceive, right? So this idea that somehow that is the distinguishing characteristic may not be accurate. But we've created all these rules in society based on this idea of physiology. And these ideas based on physiology have very real impacts on what you can and cannot have access to, and what roles in society you are or are not supposed to. So usually we create this dichotomy of male and female, and I'm going to use this dichotomy as my example because we've created hierarchies around this example. So there is what we call sexual asymmetry in terms of the hierarchy. Women tend to be subordinated in their position, in their social position and relationships with men. Gender is not alone in asymmetry. There's lots of factors that go into this as well. But in the hierarchy, it tends to be men, women, and then other genders. And we tend in Western society to rank people based on these genders. So let's talk about these genders and what they are perceived as. So let's talk about masculinity. Now, you're probably looking at these pictures going, I don't look like that. No, most people don't, because these are sliced moments in time to build up this identity, oftentimes as something that is unattainable to the vast majority of those who identify as men. So masculinity is possessing the qualities of character or characteristics that we typically appropriate or attribute to man. And we do this to not just human beings, but to animals and other things that we want to identify as masculine. Masculine is not a conscientious process. It's something that you were socialized into as you, well, in this day and age, as soon as your parents learn that you happen to have a penis on the 20th week of the pregnancy, where they do an ultrasound, parents start, now that we have this technology, they might paint your room blue, they might put sporting equipment up and everything like that. So they start this idea of what is masculine and the socialization of process into what is masculinity very early on. So it's not that being masculine or being male is bad. This isn't commentary on good or bad. This is just commentary about what is. Hegemonic masculinity is what we consider the norm, something that those who identify as men are expected to aspire to, and that women are actually discouraged from associating with. Hegemonic masculinity can be defined as a configuration of gendered practices that embody the currently accepted answer to the problem of a patriarchy or a dominant group that positions men over women. Usually we see this in most of our hierarchies. So military, top business, government agencies, tend to embody in their leadership masculine identities. And we come up with these changing expectations, by the way, of what a real man should be and what they should look like and what they should act like. And of course, nobody can actually successfully achieve this. What is considered masculine today has not necessarily been considered masculine in the past. Probably very few of you are wearing neck ruffs and cod pieces and high heels and white powdered wigs, which was considered the height of masculinity at the founding of the country. So this idea of what gets to be masculine and what doesn't changes over time. By the way, about 120 years ago, men would never be caught wearing blue. Blue was a girl color. Red was a man's color. So even over the last 120 years, we've switched up these ideas of what is masculinity. And in creating this role of masculinity, we tend to create this idealized status quo by juxtapositioning masculinity to femininity. So we use femininity, we weaponize feminine characteristics in order to socialize men to be manly. This includes sexuality or sexual identity, engaging in anything that anybody might consider feminine, like feelings. And by the way, men have gotten screwed over in the patriarchy because you're not allowed to express the full range of emotions outside very narrow situations. And that's not healthy. Like men, you didn't do better because of this. There are a lot of things that you are restricted from doing, and if you do, there's social pressures and consequences for you because of that. So I think it's important for us to kind of understand that our current ideals of masculinity haven't helped. Now, we often just juxtapose masculinity to femininity. And you can see here with my toddlers and tiaras picture that we really start to socialize femininity very early. The ideal feminine appearance in Western society is basically a young girl. That is the idealized appearance. You are supposed to have soft features, no hair, no facial hair, a very narrow waist, light skin, long flowing hair. We have these very idealized views of what is femininity. And just like with men, when you violate these idealized views, there are consequences for it. Men with good leader that are outgoing and have good leadership abilities are told they have good leadership abilities. Girls that do that are called bossy and know-it-alls. Or tomboys if they're engaging in behaviors that are not acceptable. So we often juxtapose masculinity to femininity. We weaponize femininity against men so that they will also conform. And this, again, is something that is ingrained in you from a very young age. From birth. Like you come out and mom and dad and grandparents and aunties and uncles and siblings are socializing this into you. And we create these idealized views of what we should or should not be doing. And please don't think that ladies that are watching this, or those that identify as female watching this, I am just as susceptible to all of you. Like this veil here, this is exactly what my wedding veil looked like. I had a long veil and I had a big fluffy white dress and the whole 9 yards. And I knew all of this stuff, and I'm still buying into this idea of femininity and gender, and because it's so ingrained in us at such a young age that we are taught to think in terms of this. I heard an interesting video the other day from Meryl Streep, who was talking about the fact that subordinated groups need to learn to think and speak in terms of the dominated group to get by. But dominant groups don't need to think or speak in terms of the subordinated group. And she was talking about the fact that women know how to speak man, the language of men, how to understand men, how to do for men. But men are never socialized on how to speak woman, the language of woman, how to do woman, because of that hierarchical situation. The dominant group doesn't need to learn about the subordinated groups. And that is really important as well. All right, so what does any of this have to do with firefighting? Well, let's talk a little bit about the history of firefighting. So firefighting really gets started as we start to have the development of urbanization, right? And one of the first places we see large-scale urbanization is in the Roman Empire. I'm going to use Rome specifically, the city of Rome, as an example of this. One of the first known fire brigades that we see created is by Marcus Linnus Crassus. There is no public fire brigade in Rome. So a lot of buildings made of wood with everybody using open fires means fire happens a lot in the urban space. Urban conflagrations are a huge issue, especially as you have more densely packed housing. So this fire brigade is actually created of 500 slaves, all men. And part of this is because of the stereotypes of men and women. Women are seen to be fragile and delicate. They certainly can't go fight fires, and men are considered strong and they can lift things and fight fires. So this actually, as the first fire brigade, is an interesting example because it's an extortion ring. It really is. It becomes an extortion ring. So Crassus notices that there's a fire and will send his fire brigade only to houses that are worthy of saving, and basically tell people, hey, we'll put out the fire in your house, but you have to sell me your house. And so this becomes a pretty ineffective extortion ring, but is our actual first written example of fire brigades. Now, there's always been a need to put out fires in towns, in cities, and villages, anytime you have groups of people living in close proximity together. And I promise you, men, women, children, everybody's throwing water on the fire, right? All hands on deck. But we start to create this image in Roman times of these, we have them by then, these gendered roles, and firefighting becomes a way that we kind of differentiate this. Now, Crassus's fire brigade is actually ruled illegal because it's an extortion ring, but they actually come up with some fire techniques, right? Like how to create a good bucket brigade and how to organize and how to think through starting firefighting. I mean, yeah, it's an extortion ring, but we get some ideas from it. We start then with Emperor Nero, who also took this basic idea from Crassus and goes, you know, we shouldn't make an extortion ring, but it's not a bad idea. So Nero looks at what Crassus did and goes, you know, maybe we need to kind of think through some of this. So he takes a shot at it. By the way, Nero is not necessarily a really good leader. But he takes this idea and built on it to form the Vigiles in around that time, which has companies of bucket brigades and pumps, holes, hooks, ballast to tear down buildings in order to avoid flames, right? Creating some fire barriers. And he creates actually a patrol group to patrol for the potential of fires. And when the fire would start, then would line up to the nearest water source and start to pass the buckets in order to put the fire out. So Caesar Augustus takes this idea and expands on it, and he creates the first socialized fire brigade. So he levies a 4% tax on the sale of all slaves and uses that proceeds to set up a new firefighting force. We start to see that there's about 6,000 of them. They were slaves. Slavery back in the Roman times was still slavery and still not great, but certainly not like slavery was in the Americas. We would see people who would get some rank. We would have hierarchies in there. Eventually, they became mostly made up by free men who are paid a salary. They act also as a night watch, so they're not just patrolling for fires, but they're keeping an eye out for robbery, hunting down runaway slaves, and actually really start to give us some ideas about firefighting. Now, if you're studying the history of firefighting, you see this narrative about Rome, and then like nothing happens for like 1,000 years. I mean, just like, and meh. So I don't think that's true. I think that we just don't have good histories in that period around firefighting and firefighting as a profession or firefighting as things that people do. I assure you, there are plenty of people after the fall of the Roman Empire that are trying to put out fires in their towns. They're not just all standing around going, I don't know what to do. We just don't have really a lot written down about what this was like. Odds are it was pretty much like what I just told you, because when we pick this back up in later on in like the 13 and 1400s, firefighting kind of looks the same way. People near water sources filling up buckets to dump on flames. I mean, that's just kind of the way it goes. Maybe we start to see some other sorts of technologies. We start to see some water pumps and things like that. But we really don't see a lot of advancements in fire technology. So I think that's part of the reason why we don't see a lot of history of firefighting in like the next 1,000 years. So the next time we pick up firefighting, if you were to do some research on firefighting history, is in the 17th century. So despite the lack of narrative around firefighting history, there's a ton of fires that happen. So we're going to use London as a great example. So London is a developing urban center. It is not like it is today. It is certainly a whole lot smaller. But you can see that there are tons of recorded fires in London, right? All the way from the year 60 through the year 1666, right? Tons of fires. Matter of fact, if you happen to live in this period here, right, 1130, 1132, and 1133, London's like burning down every other year. So clearly there are people doing firefighting. They're doing it with bucket brigades. Now we start to see what we call the professionalization of these jobs in the 17th century. So this includes both policing and firefighting. Before that, even when we start professionalizing this, right? So there's little training, not a lot of equipment. Throw the wet stuff on the red stuff. That's it. That is basically what firefighting comes down to, anyways. Throw the wet stuff on the red stuff. So we see the biggest fire in London in 1666. This is considered the Great Fire of London. A lot of London actually burns down in this fire. So we also see at this time the creation of insurance companies. So unlike insurance companies today, where they're theoretically supposed to pay for you to replace your stuff. Back then, you paid the insurance companies so they'd come put the fire out, right? So you're paying, it's an individual pay system in order to have firefighting happen. Now, if you couldn't afford to pay for the firefighters, your house burned down, or you needed to throw your own buckets of water on them. We also start to see some technologies that have really developed in the 15 and 1600s, thanks to the start of technologies. We see, this is the start of the Industrial Revolution. We see the development of a lot more wagons and pumps, water pumps with wagons, which means that they can take water farther. We see the creation of fire hoses that are much more resistant. These are actually cloth hoses that are treated so they are not as flammable. We actually, the fire hose size, the 50 feet that we have today, and the actual fitting, we actually see standardized in the 1700s. We still use that same standardized thing. But hoses are heavy, and firefighting is actually dangerous. Like, fighting a fire is a dangerous profession. And we have definitely this idea of women being too weak and fragile and not capable, and they're not strong enough. And they certainly can't do this job that requires manly men with a lot of strength and a lot of muscles to do on a regular basis, because women are weak. Not a new stereotype, not a new norm, and something that frankly we still see today in terms of firefighting, and that's reflected in our firefighter numbers of the amount that are women. So as we start to see this professionalization process, we see very intentional exclusion of women. I promise you, in every village and town, if a house is on fire, men, women, and children are grabbing buckets to throw water on it. There's no gender differentiation. All hands on deck. Everybody help put the thing out. It's only once we start to really see this reprofessionalization again that we definitely see the exclusion of women. Now, a lot of Europeans adopt this model that's coming out of London, and we certainly see that when we have colonization happen in the United States. Europeans are bringing this idea of firefighting as a profession over with them. So, and early on, by the way, in 1648, the New Amsterdam governor appointed 4 men to act as fire wardens. They were empowered to inspect all the chimneys and things like that, and this is some of our earliest fire laws, right? We have our earliest housing regulations and our earliest fire laws, because people were doing things like making chimneys out of wood. I promise you, your chimney is probably going to catch on fire once that wood dries out. So we have inspectors, right? Like, and when you think about this idea that in the 1600s, shortly after colonization starts, and we forced indigenous peoples off their land and we're creating town, now we've got fire regulations, building regulations, and fire wardens. We've got housing inspectors coming in. So the idea was that they were supposed to go check and make sure that people were making their houses safely and securely, because one house catching on fire often led to the entire village breaking down. We also start to have night patrols that happened here. This, again, is very much like what we saw in Europe. Fire was seen as a huge threat. We see the first fire engine company created by Benjamin Franklin, the first fire engine company created in 1678. In 1736, Benjamin Franklin establishes the first fire union company in Philadelphia. So fire is seen as a real threat, and fire brigades and housing regulations really come into play. In these early days of fire service, fire companies were organized kind of socially, if this wasn't necessarily a profession, but more part of the social hierarchy. So in order to get into the fire brigade, you have to have a certain level, you have to be a certain level in the hierarchy. And you have to be able to afford the gear. So if you're poor, you can't be a firefighter. You need to be able to afford the fancy hats and everything like that. Money that was used to help fund these organizations were obtained from insurance company payouts to firefighters. We have firefighting, we have fire insurance going on, just like we see in Europe. Of course, if you didn't have fire insurance, nobody was going to come put your home out. So everybody's going to have to grab their buckets and put your own home out. So we have, again, here's an example of an economic social hierarchy. People who can't afford to pay for the firefighting don't get firefighting services. This is actually one thing that Benjamin Franklin did really, really well. He's like, no, no, no. Just because you're poor doesn't mean your house on fire doesn't threaten to burn down Philadelphia. Everybody needs to contribute what they can based on your income and as much as you can in order to pay into this. Now, this is a white system. If you were white, you could be a firefighter. Most of the time, African Americans were denied access to this as a potential profession. Now, if you were enslaved, you were expected to go help fight fires at the big house and things like this. We see this very much as a northern thing. Southern areas had different systems, usually around organized slave brigades. But we do see freed Black communities organizing firefighting brigades as well. And we do see this in places like Philadelphia. Philadelphia actually had a fairly large freed slave system. The earliest freed slaved organized Black Firefighting Association was formed in 1818. So long history of this among the free population. But this is a job that is low pay, very dangerous, and usually done by immigrants. And so we have a lot of Irish and Scottish individuals coming over, and those men tended to get the jobs as firefighters. And it becomes a family thing. If I'm a firefighter, my kids are expected to take on that job and keep going. Like I said, we have this history in place. So firefighting today, there is an estimated about 1 million career and volunteer firefighters in the United States. Of the total number of firefighters, about 35% are career firefighters and 65% are volunteers. Volunteer companies are super important because there's a lot of communities that can't afford to pay for a full-time firefighter force. The other way that things are done is sometimes they contract out. So here in SLO County, we have the 5 cities down here in South County. They have a collective firefighting force. The city of SLO has a firefighting force, but the areas in between, like Edna and Los Osos and places like that, they actually contract with CAL FIRE to do their firefighting. So they already have individuals that are trained. They get trained on urban firefighting as well as wildfires, and they're contracted to do firefighting in these areas. Among the about just under 10% of firefighters, about 9% are female. We have a much higher percentage of volunteers that are female. In 2021, which is the latest statistics we can see on pay, female firefighters with the same level of experience, the same amount of time on the job, the same background and education, make 82% of what their male colleagues made. So we have pay inequalities occurring within the firefighting system. This is not long ago. This was just a couple of years ago that these statistics came out. Unsurprisingly, firefighting is a young person's game. So 50% are between 30 and 49. Another 20% are under the age of 30, because firefighting is hard on your body. It just is. It's a rough gig. Most firefighters are still white. And this is especially true when you leave urban areas and you get into more rural areas. It becomes even more white. Followed by Latino and African American and Asians. About 5% are part of the GLBTQ, the LGBTQIA community. And so you can see that we really don't have a lot of diversity, even today, in firefighting. It's still mostly white and mostly male, despite efforts to have something else. So a little bit about the history of female firefighters. The first female firefighter was Molly Williams. She was an African-American slave in New York. She became a member of the Oceanus Engine in 1815. We unfortunately don't know a lot about her life. We know that she was one of the first to actually get that job, which was pretty amazing because that's breaking a lot of ceilings. Most women historically were volunteers, even in the 1800s. Again, all hands on deck. Here's the Gritton College Women's Brigade, because it's a women's college. There's no men around. If there is a fire that breaks out, these are the women that are going to fight it. So this undermines that social narrative that women can't do this. And I want you to imagine trying to fight fires in a corset, because these women are all wearing corsets. Corsets are not firefighting gear. I promise you, they are very constrictive. So most women historically were volunteers, even in the 18 and 1900s. Obviously, this is a necessity in small towns and on women's colleges when there just wasn't men around. We see this especially when World War I and World War II happens. Suddenly all the men go over there, which is not here. And women are perfectly capable of doing this job. They move into it temporarily. So women are doing lots of things men can do during World War I and World War II. We hear stories like Rosie the Riveter and things like that. In times of need, it's amazing that suddenly women are perfectly capable of doing these jobs. But the second there isn't a direct need, these women are told they have to leave. They are suddenly no longer capable of doing these jobs. And this really gets started the first, second, and third wave and fourth wave feminism, right? So we see first wave feminism happening in the after the Civil War, when women are in a lot of these roles going, yeah, listen, while you were all fighting that war, we're doing all this stuff at home, and we would like to be full citizens. I mean, we want to have a right to vote. We want to have a say in our government. And of course, because we have hierarchies and women don't have access to power, we have to wait for men to give us the right to vote. So and that actually comes after the Civil War, where Black men are given the right to vote. Black women are not given the right to vote, even though they're Black. That's a whole other story, though. In World War I and II, women are replacing men all over the place. We see one of the first female fire chiefs come into play. In the 1960s, there are tons of wildland crews and female crews that occur. In 1942, we see the first all-female forestry firefighting crew in California. We see one of the first head chiefs in California, in Oregon, that happens. So it's not that women aren't capable of doing this. We have those social norms and roles. Women are considered too weak, but clearly we have examples of women being just as capable of doing this. So females firefighters today, in 2018, like I said, about 8 to 9% are women. A lot of the career firefighters, it's around 4%. Volunteers is a bit higher. and we're going to watch a short video. So this video is about how important it is to have diverse firefighting teams. Firefighting has changed a lot in the last 200 years. Our technologies have changed, how we engage in firefighting has changed. So the video we're going to watch is really about how we really need to have good diversity in firefighting.
When you think of firefighters, who do you picture? Burly white male, perhaps? Hot, sexy Mr. November on the firefighters' calendar? Well, considering that 95% of all urban firefighters in Australia are white men, it's not surprising. And whilst I have the utmost respect for all the men in our fire service, this image that we have in our heads, it needs to change. You see, a homogenous workforce and this outdated calendar stereotype are no longer relevant in the modern fire service, and they actually limit our capabilities. Today, I want to tell you why your fire and rescue service needs to have a mix of firefighters because of the range of activities that we're required to do to keep you safe. Historically, firefighters only went to fires. That was it. The work was hot, heavy, and dangerous. Like this ferocious fire here at the Goldsboro Mort wool store, formerly just across the road from where we sit today. In 1935, it burned for days and threatened to take all of Sydney with it. The job's changed a lot since then. Buildings have fire protection systems, we know more about preventing fires, and we do more medical and rescue work than ever before. So what do we really do? Of course, we still put fires out, but we do so much more. For example, at a recent car accident I attended in Bathurst, I had to crawl through the side window of a crushed and overturned car to help rescue a severely injured man. His teenage daughter had crashed and rolled the car on that day while she was learning to drive. Our most senior firefighter, who incidentally looks like Mr. November, was too big to fit through the side window. So myself and my two other crew members used specialised rescue techniques to release the man and slide him out through the front windscreen to safety. As a woman and as the officer in charge that day, it was both appropriate and acceptable for me to hug that distressed teenage driver and reassure her that her dad was going to be okay. And in another job, an old man fell out of his bed and laid for 2 days on the floor with a broken hip until his family could investigate. When we arrived, we sent our smallest firefighter down through the roof cavity. She then reassured the old man in Italian and was able to translate between his family and the ambulance crew. This old man was saved that day because of this firefighter's small size and her cultural competence. And in a bizarre job just recently, a junior firefighter had to hold and stabilise a man's inflamed penis while another firefighter used pressurised cutting tools with absolute surgical precision to remove multiple stainless steel rings. I know it sounds odd, but it's all part of our job. In actual fact, responding to fires and other emergencies such as this accounts for only 7% of the work we do. The other 93% is spent saving lives in prevention, preparedness, and working alongside other emergency services. In order to be effective in all of these situations, we must work in teams. Our fire trucks are like giant red toolboxes where we select the right combination of tools, skills, knowledge, and experience to solve problems. But just how versatile can our teams be when less than 5% of our firefighters are women and less than 2% are from ethnically diverse backgrounds? And it would appear that the whole world has the same problem. A couple of years ago, I had the absolute privilege to travel all around the world on a Winston Churchill Fellowship to research what best practice in the fire service looked like. I travelled to Japan, India, England, and North America, visiting all their fire and rescue services. I discovered that recruitment strategies such as quotas and girls' fire camps were making significant difference, and that best practice focused on preventing emergencies and building community resilience. In Australia, fire and emergency services are recognising the need to remain relevant in our rapidly changing world. We are actively recruiting a diverse workforce, and we're making sure that you all know who we are and the range of things that we do. We have increased the numbers of women, Indigenous, and ethnically diverse people in all of our emergency services. Not only has this made us more versatile and broadened our capabilities, it's also really made a significant impact on the culture in our fire stations and our other workplaces. Slowly, the message is spreading that we are rescuers, protectors, and educators. We participate in your cultural, sporting, religious, and events, and in time, you can expect us to look even more like you. Change is slow, but we're definitely heading in the right direction. And the best thing is that you can help too. Stop thinking tall, sexy Mr. November is your local firefighter, and start thinking captain capability, fit, intellectually and emotionally strong, multi-skilled, and connected to you. So the next time you see a giant red toolbox go flying past, imagine a crew of men and women inside that reflect your community with the range of skill sets to solve all problems and guarantee your safety. Thank you.
So it's really important as we think of the future of firefighting as a profession, that we really think, just like she said, of getting away from the stereotype of big white men running to the rescue to put out firefighting, put out fires in buildings. In fact, most buildings today, including your homes, should have sprinkler systems to help with fire suppression. We really need to be thinking about the profession more broadly. We need to be thinking about a variety of capabilities and capacities as we go into this new age of firefighting. And so as we think through firefighting as a profession in the future, we really need to be thinking about the importance of diversity. And this notion of barriers in place, which still obviously are something that are very much prominent in firefighting as a profession, we really need to be thinking about breaking down. And that's because we need a more diverse workforce, not less, in firefighting as a profession. So I'm going to have you watch a video. There is a link on the Canvas course shell that is going to talk about the integration of the NYPD. NYPD is a special place. For a very long time, they had these hyper-masculine practices of pulling carts, pulling their firefighting equipment by hand, even after almost every other agency had employed these crazy things called horses and then steam engines. NYPD is still like, yeah, we're going to hand pull these trucks downtown. Crazy idea. But that really plays into this idea of hyper-masculinity as part of firefighting. And in the 1980s, we start to see the integration of NYPD, and it's rough. Most of the people that were in the department weren't interested in having women. It was still mostly white men. So even minority men, still kind of sketchy. but this is about the integration of women into the NYFD, so not NYPD. Although the NYPD, by the way, the New York Police Department, also had the same issues as the New York Fire Department. Like they're very much paralleled in terms of who historically was involved, where they were at, their ideals around masculinity and everything like that. So we have seen some changes, but NYFD is still very much a white male dominated department, even though a lot of other places have a bit more diversity. I hope you've learned a little bit about the firefighting profession and where we need to go, and the fact that firefighting as it was in the old days is not where firefighting is going to go today. And certainly not where firefighting is going to be in the future. And the fact that we need a lot of diversity and a lot of extended capacity. And I will see you all in the next lecture.